Dozens of protesters are reported dead in Myanmar as junta leaders put on a show of strength for Armed Forces Day. Deaths are being reported across the country, with many in the city of Mandalay. Earlier, the general warned protesters they risk being shot in the head and back. More than 300 people have been killed since pro-democracy rallies broke out in February. From Kuala Lumpur, I am joined by journalist David Gunabam. David, welcome to DW. The Armed Forces Day Parade is supposed to honor the Myanmar military's past, but it's clear that today it's being used as a platform to continue a war on its own people, isn't it?
There's no question about it that this is an army at war with its own people in Myanmar. I mean, there are reports, credible reports, of more than 90 people killed today. So we could be looking at a death toll potentially of more than 400 total since the military coup was staged on February 1st. So many of these people shot in the head. I mean, the warning came on state media about the possibility of demonstrators being shot in the head today. Well, they've been doing that for weeks. Protesters have been getting shot in the head. So many unarmed civilians dead at the hands of the country's security forces. This is part of the military junta's plan to just terrorize the civilian population. Just like Myanmar juntas in past have done, well, this new junta is doing the same thing. Not only with the number of people that they're killing on the streets and in their homes, but they're just terrorizing them with nighttime raids. I mean, I've spoken to people in Myanmar this week who tell me they are terrified every time they hear a knock on the door. And sometimes it's not a knock on the door. Sometimes it's a door being kicked down when security forces raid. You see people who are in custody with the security forces, wounded people without weapons, clearly in custody, no way to fight back, and yet they get beaten by the security forces. Sometimes people get taken away by the security forces and they turn up dead the next day. This junta is just terrorizing the civilian population.
David, talks are underway that might lead to the resistance having its own army to fight Myanmar's military head-on. Can you explain how this could work and where the troops for this resistance army would come from?
Sure. So the first thing I have to do is give you a little bit of context on the country. In the outer reaches of Myanmar, around the periphery, you've got ethnic minority states. And these ethnic minority states are tired of having a highly centralized government that's dominated by the majority ethnic group, the Burmese, and this highly centralized government being able to call the shots across the country. And these ethnic minority states, they have long wanted more autonomy and more say over their own affairs. And there's actually ethnic armed groups with weapons here that have been fighting battles against the Myanmar army for decades to try and give their respective states more autonomy. Well, now discussions are underway that could potentially lead to bringing these different armed ethnic groups together into one sort of national resistance army. Now, there's roughly 24 of these armed groups. Depending on how many of them you can get to pull together and sign on to the sort of national resistance army, you could potentially be looking at a sort of resistance force of about 100,000 maybe, plus whoever they could recruit from the civilian population on top of that. They would still be way outnumbered by the Myanmar army, which has more than 400,000, and it's better resourced. But still, 100,000 could still cause a lot of problems for the Myanmar army. Now, I should say there's still a lot of discussions and a lot of details that need to be worked out before this sort of unified resistance army could come together.
You know, the coup leader, Min Aung Hlaing, said the army seeks to join hands with the entire nation to safeguard democracy. That's an exact quote, if I recollect. Should the international community be assured by that?
The international community clearly rejects it, just like most of the population inside the country rejects it. I mean, somebody going for democracy would not allow the army that he's in charge of to shoot down so many unarmed civilians, to terrorize the civilian population. It is very clear. Min Aung Hlaing is out to protect the regime. The generals of Myanmar are out for the regime and to protect the fortune that they've amassed over decades through this country's natural resources, through the businesses they control. While so many of the people in the population live in poverty, these generals are millionaires and they're trying to protect their regime.
Journalist David Gunabam, really appreciate your insight in all this. Thank you.